American President Donald Trump has finally stated exactly how the war between the US and Israel against Iran should end. However, despite this, the prospects for its end are unclear. Nevertheless, from Trump's statements and those of his officials, as well as from how this war is developing, in this episode, we will look at what scenarios regarding Iran are currently available to Donald Trump and how the war with Iran might end. My name is Alexei Pecci, and this is my personal project, Conspiracy Theories, in which we actually do the opposite. We debunk conspiracy theories and try to find the truth. And we talk about complex geopolitical processes, but in simple terms. So, let's start with Donald Trump's own uncertainty regarding the war against Iran. On the one hand, all his convoluted statements that contradict each other can of course be infuriating. But on the other hand, the United States of America, regardless of Trump, has long used this method of strategic uncertainty and has successfully applied this principle for decades, for example, in relation to Taiwan and China. Because on the one hand, by not officially recognizing the war or the island's independence, and on the other hand, by promising to help it in case of an attack from the mainland, while at the same time successfully developing pragmatic relations with both Beijing and Taipei. Well, it's not clear, whether the US President Donald Trump knows about this method, but in the case of the current war with Iran, he has taken this principle to the absolute extreme. That is total strategic uncertainty. Be that as it may, it's completely unclear what the goals of the war are, what possible methods of continuing it might be, how to end it, or even what should actually be considered a victory, and so on. And if the US itself doesn't know its own plans, then no Iranian intelligence can intercept them, not even theoretically. I'll say it straight, the parallels with Russian aggression against Ukraine are just too obvious to ignore. Although the difference is huge, even just on a stylistic level. Pete Hegseth's statement is about the fact that the US didn't start this war but is finishing it. The statement by White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was that Iran was planning to attack the United States of America, so Trump launched a preemptive strike. And finally, there's Trump's own statement that the US hasn't even started yet. Well, that's literally a word-for-word repetition of Vladimir Putin's statements in 2022. So, within this strategy, you could say that Trump follows a simple rule. Wherever you end up, that's your target. Whatever you achieve, that was the goal. Based on this, it's worth considering the scenarios for ending the war against Iran that Donald Trump has at his disposal. And actually, there aren't that many of them. The first scenario is war until total victory. Iran stubbornly refuses to surrender, continuing to snap back and shell its surrounding neighbors. Moreover, the most serious missile arguments may be saved for last, when the enemy's air defense will already be exhausted by Shahed drone attacks. Iran's conventional forces are also badly battered, but the regime continues to hold on. In such a scenario, Trump finally decides on a ground operation, obviously using, for example, the long-suffering Kurds. Or Trump might demand that NATO send a multinational military contingent. All of this will turn into a truly bloody war with no way out. And even if the so-called good guys ultimately defeat the bad guys, like in Syria, Iran will remain a source of instability in the region for a long time. In the process, oil prices will just go through the roof. Russia, unfortunately, in this scenario, patches up its leaky budget and continues the war of attrition against Ukraine for many more years. As you can understand, such a scenario doesn't suit us at all. There is another scenario as well. It is a kind of grand bargain. Moreover, as I believe, and as I've already argued extensively on this YouTube channel, this is the most desirable scenario for the White House, which is stated almost directly. Basically, this is Venezuela 2.0. However, the Iranian regime looks much more stable than the Latin American one. The Khamenei regime is far more stable than the Maduro regime ever was. They have demonstrated this in practice. Even during these 2 weeks of war, the death of any leader or commander does not lead to paralysis of the system. A new person takes the vacant position, and in principle, this institution, as a clerical regime, continues to exist. Well, besides that, in the case of Venezuela, basically, there was no need to take into account such factors as the willingness of a large number of people to give their lives. In the name of the coming of the new supreme leader, in the name of the coming of Imam al-Mahdi, in the name of heritage, the beginning of the end times, and so on. Well, in short, there was no religious component there after all. It was precisely this component that Trump and his team of geopolitical grandmasters led by Steve Witkoff might have overlooked. They just thought that the religious component there was simply a cover. On the other hand, the Iranian regime doesn't look all that monolithic either. There's no need to overestimate it. After the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the election of his son as the new leader, all power in the country de facto passed into the hands of the military, the elite of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And based on a number of indirect signs, it can be concluded that other, more moderate wings of the Iranian elite are not thrilled about this turn of events. Therefore, potentially, these other elites are capable of making agreements. That is, in any case, there remains a certain opposition within Iran, reformists, more liberally minded political forces, and so on, with whom it is possible to try to negotiate. Only if they are somehow able to seize control of the situation. For now, however, the IRGC's position looks quite strong, and it will be difficult to take over. For Ukraine, the scenario of a big deal might also turn out to be the best of all possible options, especially if Ukraine takes into account the release of huge reserves of Iranian oil onto the world market. But even the unblocking of the Hormuz Strait by itself will lower global oil prices. That's a plus for Ukraine. Accordingly, the flow of petrodollars to Moscow will decrease, and that's great news. And the worst-case scenario for the Allies is war. Let's put it this way, an outsourced war. That's what I'll call it. But let's be honest, Donald Trump has abandoned his allies to their fate before. By the way, the Kurds could tell you a lot about this, but not the Iraqi or Iranian Kurds, the Syrian ones. They could warn their colleagues that Trump might betray them. And it is possible, I emphasize possible, that at some point the personal interests of Donald Trump and the United States of America will become more important than the interests and ties of the US with Israel and the monarchies of the Persian Gulf. Donald Trump has congressional elections coming up. If the polling data is convincing enough for Trump to realize the possible catastrophe for the Republicans in the congressional elections, the US may very well pull out of this war. And once again, no goals were announced. What is the direct goal of this war? It was never clearly defined, so anything can be called a goal, and victory can be defined in different ways. Obviously, by shifting all responsibility for continuing the war onto Israel and the Gulf Arab countries, Trump will simply withdraw from the war. Well, maybe with American support in terms of intelligence and air defense missiles. By the way, for Ukraine, again, this is the most unpleasant aspect of this scenario, because the shortage of Patriot missiles is a real problem. If the US withdraws from the war but still supports air defense, Ukraine will receive fewer missiles. However, right here, Ukraine finally gets some trump cards, some advantages that Trump has stubbornly tried to ignore until now. Practical military assistance to the Persian Gulf monarchies is something that can definitely be played, including with the participation of the Americans. It's actually great that the Persian Gulf countries are now interested in our interceptor drones. At the same time, the Middle East region will continue to burn, or at least smolder, for a long time. The Iranian regime, having lost part of its military potential, will compensate for it with a potential for malice. And oil prices will fluctuate at a higher level than before the war. With possible easing, of course, and so on, nevertheless, it's unlikely that the price will drop to pre-war levels. And here, much will depend on how the US exit will be arranged. Systematically, thoughtfully, or in the style of Donald Trump, coming as a surprise to enemies, allies, and his own administration. That is, of course, the scenarios can be different. Friends, what scenarios for ending the war in the Middle East do you personally see? Based on Donald Trump's rhetoric and the overall geopolitical situation, share your views in the comments under this episode. Write your opinion, your comments, your disagreement with any of my arguments. But I want to emphasize, this format is speculation, it's reasoning and an attempt to find the truth. I'll leave it at that. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. And if you like this format, if you find it useful, you can support our YouTube channel financially with any donation or a paid membership using the links and details in the description of this video. or by using the QR code on your screen. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.